Well, good evening to
Hello,
everyone.
Christopher.
Hey, how's it going tonight, Ron?
Happy thanks. I was going to say happy Thanksgiving week.
It is. You gearing up for a big turkey day?
Yeah, absolutely. It's always going to be fun. There's going to be a lot of kids running around and everything like that. And I will tell you, last week we did a repeat show, and as we were talking about what we were going to do this week, you came up with a marvelous idea of looking at Native American traditions, and I think that this is a great homage to the First Nations people here, when kind of celebrating Thanksgiving in a different way.
Absolutely. I thought that I wanted to do something that was a little thematic, and I thought that was all about our sort of initial truce with the natives here, not too far away from me, here in Connecticut, over in Massachusetts, with the Wampanoag people, and so why not celebrate a little bit of their darker heritage, and of course do that in a respectful way. And so I think it's going to be a fun show tonight, examining some of the darker legends from Native belief and Native folklore.
The darker aspects of of the Native Americans, absolutely. And I've known you now for a little bit over a year, Chris, and I would say that your whole life pretty much revolves around themes, and I like that.
It very, very much does, actually. So
Yeah.
by the way, ladies and gentlemen, just a quick note to everybody out there, is that we've had a nice little breakthrough here on our channel, Dead Air Full Spectrum, which is that we have finally reached the threshold on the channel where we can begin to monetize, which means that we can get a little bit of kickback if we have advertisements and things like that, which I'm sure it's the most thing though that we'll actually get some ads on screen, but for us that's wonderful because that helps us to do the things that we potentially build some revenue here. And just a quick note that if you're in chat tonight, one of the things that we have as a new option is the ability to donate. And so what we do here on Dare Full Spectrum across all of our various channels, what we do here on Monday Night Monsters, you have the never a requirement, but you do have the option if you'd like to donate a couple of dollars here and there to us to help us do what we do. And of course, for every one of those donations, we vastly appreciate it. So just want to let you folks know that that's an option now.
Absolutely. They can now be known as super chatters. And the first person that will donate tonight, I will do a little dance.
Oh, well, of course, now that's going to drive away donations because nobody wants to see us dance and nobody wants to see us sing, but always worth a shot.
However, if you would go
So
to my
folks,
TikTok site, it's pretty popular.
Oh, sure. So, okay. So you're doing TikTok dances now. I don't have that kind of coordination. So I'm definitely going to beg off on that one. So guys, let's get started. We do have a great show tonight, and but before we do that, we're going to kind of give a little quick refresher here on I'm sure that we have some people that are outside of the U.S. that watch us, so whether that's live or on YouTube later on, and just a little information about what part of our theme is, or at least what the inspiration for our theme is tonight, because back in 1621, in October of 1621, a gathering of English settlers, we call them today the Pilgrims, but they would have just been known as settlers back then, and the Wampanoag tribe, who were the tribe along the Massachusetts coastline around the Cape Cod area back in 1621, gathered together for a feast, which actually lasted about 3 days, and this feast was to celebrate the first harvest of the settlers in the New World. And this, of course, would become what we today call Thanksgiving. And the truth is, and we have to acknowledge this, that the truce between these cultures would not last forever and things would take a bad turn eventually. But at that time and for the next few years after that, there was peace. And it's a moment of celebration that we do still honor today. And so that's the inspiration behind the stories that we're talking to tonight is the various native peoples who were here and have an older and greater claim to this land than we do. And so we want to respect their culture, but also talk about some of their more nightmarish legends, because, of course, that's what we do here. So I'm really looking forward to some of these beasties tonight on the show.
And putting this together, you can see a great correlation between a lot of our myths and legends that we cover on the show, from Bigfoot and things like fairies and such. I think it's going to be a very interesting show to start connecting these dots. Oh, wait a second. 35, you know what? There we go. I'm going to start doing a little
gravy,
dance.
John. Well, Nobody wants to see me dance, but Ron, you got this covered. So,
Woo!
guys, thank you so
I'll
much.
tell
That
you
is
what, man.
massively appreciated. So,
I am
so
absolutely
John,
stunned
I
by
owe
the
you a coffee for that one
generosity.
at the very least, or possibly dinner.
Yes,
So
that's right.
let's
That's
tell
right.
you what. Let's since we were talking about the Wampanoag. Cody, nice to see you. Sarah, here. I saw Mary Beth was in here as well. Got a lot of folks on board tonight, which is wonderful. So great. So let's start out because we were talking about the fact that the settlers, the English settlers, the people that they, the natives that they had association with were the Wampanoag tribe on the far side of the eastern side of Narragansett Bay, heading over towards the Massachusetts and Cape Cod area. And it's a Wampanoag legend that we're actually going to start out with tonight, which is a fascinating legend that's very, very popular, especially on the south coast of Massachusetts, which is the Pukwudgie. And this is one that I'm sure as a cryptozoologist, you know a lot about, Ron. But these nature spirits of Wampanoag folklore were once considered to be allies of humankind, but eventually, depending on the legend you read, eventually turned against the tribes. And Pukwudgies tend to be portrayed often as kind of fierce, silly-looking creatures, but in native folklore, they could be very dark and indeed very malevolent. And I think that, just as you were saying a few minutes ago, they're really very comparable to the goblins and the other kind of like mischievous and dangerous nature spirits that we would see in Celtic and European folklore that so many of us of European descent grew up with.
But this is one of my favorite subjects, of course, is the Fae and all these kind of ethereal creatures. What I find so interesting about the Pukwudgie and the way that it's represented in Native American folklore, it's almost identical to the pixie that we have in the cultures in Western Europe, down to the idea that pixies can take on the shape of hedgehogs. And while we don't have hedgehogs here in the States, we do have porcupines. So they're often seen as wearing these quills, so they're camouflaged in the natural world. But even more stunning, I think, is whenever you look at the word Pukwudgie, and the very first syllable on that is puck. And then we have
Puck,
the
of course.
European tradition of the puka, right? And
Yeah.
Shakespeare even had Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and he was a shape-shifting spirit as well, too. So it's very interesting that cultures that really didn't have any kind of connection until later on were able to independently develop this type of creature within the. So the question needs to be asked: are these creatures? Is that the name that the creatures have for themselves, and we borrowed it from them, rather than we put that name upon them?
It's true, and it begs quite a few versions of the question. So you have to ask yourself: is it because these creatures are ubiquitous all over the world? Is it because there are versions of these creatures all over the planet? Obviously, if fairies, spirits, and all these kind of creatures, puka and goblins exist, they wouldn't be limited only to one section of the world. So perhaps that would be a good excuse or a good explanation for that. The other is, has there at some much earlier point in time been cross-cultural contact or dissent between these various peoples? Of course, all of the various humans all over the earth came from central locations. We didn't independently develop. And did we somehow carry forth some remnant of these beliefs and carry it over? And we're going to see that a lot tonight. I think it's a fascinating thought to wonder if, in fact, there's either contact we don't know about at an earlier stage, whether they inherited some of it from one another, or in fact, is there a common ancestry to these myths and legends, or in fact are just pukas everywhere, so I think that it raises a lot of fascinating questions.
Absolutely,
Depending on what side of the fence you fall on.
Yeah, and you and I really don't kind of, subscribe to the woo all that much, but there is something in the fact that, is it possible these are based upon a true creature of some kind that is remembered in our collective unconsciousness and becomes a ubiquitous folklore among people all over the planet? That's something very interesting, because we do talk a lot about the history of certain types of things that go bump in the night. But I think this is one of those times, especially in the discussion of Native American folklore, that are these things that we're discussing based upon flesh and blood creatures.
And I'm a huge proponent of that. I mean, it's true. We have a tendency to lean heavily into the scientific, heavily into the history here, but that doesn't preclude the idea that some basis of truth, some even potentially what we would call paranormal or supernatural explanation, because I'm a believer that those things exist on some level. I do think that, we have a tendency to see them often when they're not there, but I think that somewhere beneath the sort of veil that hides the unseen world from us, that there is some element of sort of paranormal activity that exists out there, and indeed these might be echoes of exactly that kind of thing. And so it is fun sometimes to peel back the layers of history and find the origins of these things from a rational and scientific point of view. But once the rational and the scientific runs out, you're looking for a paranormal explanation, and I do find that fascinating.
Yep.
Now, we're not going to stick just with East Coast native tribes. We're actually going to cover stories from tribes all over the nation, primarily North America. We don't really dive into too much Mesoamerican or anything, although there'll be a little bit of that tonight. But the next beastie on our list that I'd like to bring up is something called Utkena. I don't have to admit that I am not necessarily pronouncing these correctly, the Uktina rather, but this would be a dragon-like river-dwelling serpent with horns and sometimes portrayed with wings from Muskogee and other tribal lore of the Southeast. And this is a fascinating creature because the way it is described with the horns, with the wings and everything is, I think, very, very reminiscent of the European myth of the dragon. And again, it certainly begs the question whether there might be some survival of belief that came from an earlier culture or an earlier contact with some creature of this kind. But one thing I did find fascinating is that while we're not going to dive a lot into Mesoamerican beliefs tonight, this does also bear a striking resemblance conceptually to the Aztec myth of Quetzalcoatl, which is the winged serpent, which is literally what the name means, a winged and horned serpent god from Aztec belief. And this idea of this winged and horned serpent who they worshipped as a god possibly existing in some form and being a memory of a dragon-like creature from a past age that's carried down fascinates me. And whether in fact dragons really exist. Personally, I am one of those people who absolutely thrilled if dragons really existed. I've been a lifelong Dungeons and Dragons guy, and if I ever get to ride a dragon, I'm there.
Absolutely. I will tell you this, though. I had taken my kids on a tour of a museum exhibit that had live reptiles involved in it. And there was one snake, and I believe it was from Africa, if I'm not mistaken. I get the willies whenever I think of snakes anyways. But this snake had such large scaling that it actually appeared as if it was feathered. So it's very possible that we're hearkening back to a reptile that no longer exists anymore, that was known in an earlier time. That's a very strong possibility as well. But the idea that dragons, the idea that a flying serpent out there is part of our mythos, or part of our collective mythos around the world. And I sure hope that something like this did exist, because the world would be a lot more interesting if it did.
I also think it's fascinating that, of course, in the last couple of decades, we've come to understand more and more about dinosaurs, and the idea that the connection between dinosaurs and birds is much closer than we ever imagined, and that early dinosaurs, there are a variety of species that would have had feathers, proto-feathers, before sort of the species that became birds ended up evolving from them. So the idea of a winged serpent is not entirely insane from even a biological standpoint. I do imagine that the idea of a survival of belief in whether it's ancient artwork or what have you, anywhere on the planet of these dragon-like creatures could certainly be based on something real. And I do hold out hope. Now, I mean, I'm right there with the from Jurassic Park with the idea is just because we can do it doesn't mean that we should. But if anybody ever does decide to resurrect dinosaurs, I think winged and feathered dinosaurs would be the most fun.
Absolutely. I do want to point out, because somebody talked about the Archaeopteryx on here. We do have to point out that in the fossil record, we do have the largest known pterosaur, and it was named after Quetzalcoatl. It's the Quetzalcoatlus. This is the largest, it had a wingspan of about 35 feet. So at least in ancient past, Quetzalcoatl did indeed exist and fly our friendly skies.
which to me is again a beautiful thing and fascinating. And that's sort of almost retrofitting the idea that possibly that these creatures from religion actually were based on real living creatures, and that the idea that at a later date they would then use the religious iconography to name the creatures when we discover them. So you get that full circle, which is ironically Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. So a little bit of irony in there. So now the idea of the winged serpent is both romantic, and I think the creature sounds like it would be a beautiful thing, but not all of these creatures from native folklore are quite as attractive or quite as friendly. And so the next one on our is a much less attractive creature. I think that this would be pronounced Taihan, which sounds a little Asian, but that's not entirely unreasonable. Vicious and eternally hungry cannibalistic dwarves who appear in Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Comanche, as well as other Plains tribal legend. Now, these are the names of these goblin-like creatures generally translate to something meaning small and strong. And so, as with most creature names, especially from Aboriginal societies, the name was meant to be descriptive. But these, again, very goblin-like creatures are common all throughout the Plains lore. And the thing about the Taihan is that it is not only fierce, but it also wields dark magic, and they can become invisible. They can run with incredible speed, outrunning any human being. So if they're hunting you, running is probably not your best way to get away from them, and they can place curses on their prey. So this is a very frightful type of creature, and I would say that one of the darkest of the creatures that we have on our list today. We have a few real dark ones, but this is definitely one of the most of them. The idea of these cannibalistic goblin dwarves, not one that I would want to meet on a dark night.
Absolutely. And somebody mentioned in the chat room a few weeks ago about the idea of dwarves and doing a story on the idea of these kind of races that were believed to have been here in our ancient past. And what is really fascinating from a historical perspective, whenever you look at things like the Pukwudgie, or you look at things like even the Puka, or let's go to Hawaii for instance and go to the Menehune. These are all anthropomorphic. They're all very small humanoids. They were believed to be givers of culture in some way, and the alliance between their race and our race somehow fell apart. It seems too good to be true, to tell you the truth. It seems as if this is an actual encounter with some sort of species that simply did not go well in our ancient past, that we learned from them, that we interacted with them, but they lost the evolutionary arms race and are no longer here. If you would look at the Homo florensis in Indonesia, the little hobbit, it is appearing as if in our ancient past. I'm not talking about tens of thousands of years ago. I'm talking about fairly modern, maybe 5,000 or 7,000 years ago, that we were around races of other beings, almost like ourselves. And if you go farther back into the fossil record, 45,000 years ago, we were anatomically modern humans, and we shared this world with Neanderthals. We shared this world with Homo florensis, and who knows what else we shared this world with. And I do believe, from a cryptozoological point of view, that a lot of these interactions that we had with these creatures in the past has been not forgotten, but carried on in a traditional way through some sort of oral language, some sort of oral retelling, to the point that it's almost like a game of telephone. And by the time it comes to us, it's just a mere shadow of what it originally was. But at least in my research, I think that what a lot of these things that we call cryptozoological and a lot of these things we call paranormal were indeed flesh and blood creatures that we had to deal with in our ancient past.
It makes perfect sense. And if you even think about, even today, there are survival of different tribal peoples in areas like Borneo, or even in the Australian outback with the Aboriginal people, who physically have so many differences than most of the races around them, of course, because most of Australia, of course, being colonized by English Caucasian people at this point. But the physical differences between these two groups of people they're actually quite striking. And you have to think, where, at what point in the evolutionary branch, did these two races split apart? And if they are, for instance, an evolved form of a different branch altogether that were short, diminutive, more diminutive of stature, that were maybe thicker, built for, rougher conditions. And if you do trace these back far enough, do you have genuinely distinct branches of human evolution that would have produced radically different types of people that today, to our eyes, might have seemed like a different species altogether? And to me, that is fascinating. And certainly with animal species, that's very much true as well.
Right. Yeah. When we talk about, humanoids, we talk about, races of Homo sapiens, then we're talking about remnant populations that somehow survived in, remote recesses of the jungles. And they were able to stay away from us because, we like to kill things. And they were just a memory, of what was actually happening. But I know whenever the Dutch started to settle the Indonesian area, they had reports of these diminutive humans that would come out of the mountains and steal children, steal food. So is that a possibility that when we talk about, the late 1500s, that this was a actual sighting of the Homo florensis, which now has entered into the fossil record, that we know that these are indeed true creatures that existed and probably no longer do?
And you also have to think about the fact that in so many cases, especially with West Caucasian civilizations, when we observed, tribes and cultures of people that were physically different from us, we often assumed that they were not human, and that ended up really coloring the way that we would report them. And so when you see, the different names that were given to these people, it was often, and obviously we're talking to some degree even about African slavery, the idea that because of the biological or physiological differences between what was considered to be normal among the Caucasian peoples, that we would assume that that people, especially in these the southern African tribes, the southern India, even throughout Asia, they were so physically different from what the Western cultures were accustomed to that they would often presume that they were different species altogether. And unfortunately, that led to some terrible, terrible tragedies. But it does color our reporting and the way some of these early books on biology and naturalism were written. So it's easy enough to imagine that even these led to the belief in these races of little people or races of giants, because they were so different from what we were accustomed to seeing.
Absolutely. Agree totally.
Now, we're going to be on that same track in just a moment here, because the next creature we want to address is one that was one of your suggestions, and I'm interested to hear your perspectives on it, because there is an interesting legend that comes from, what is it, the Ojibwe? Let's see, this was new to me. So the Cheyenne actually were one of the people who had this belief in what often referred to as Maximista, or the stone giants. And rather than being what I initially thought when I saw that name, and sort of meant to be enormous creatures of stone, these were much more closely related to what we would call a Sasquatch today in modern perspective. 7 to 9 feet tall, man-like creatures, most similar to the Sasquatch of modern folklore, but they were huge, hair-covered men. And according to Cheyenne legend and legend of some of the other tribes that have records of these, they were meant to be the first inhabitants of Earth, the first people in a way, which is intriguing, because so many native tribes, their actual names to them in their language simply mean the people or the first people, and you were referring to them as the First Nations earlier. But even they have records, or rather legends, of people that existed before them, but people that were quite different. And the thing about the stone giants is that they even have an explanation for why we don't see them today. That because they were monstrous in size, they were still supposedly very gentle creatures, and they had been tasked by the gods as the protectors of Earth and given special magics to do that. But apparently some of them misused these magics, not for ill, but just for their own personal gain, and ended up being cursed by the gods. And one of the stone giants, one of the Maximista, pleaded with the gods, saying that it was only some who had misused the magic, not to wipe them out. And according to Cheyenne myth, the gods instead banished them, basically to be outcasts, from sight, living sort of away from some civilization in the forest. But that is why we rarely see them. But interestingly enough, that dovetails beautifully with the sauce that we would get a case of them, but they would be virtually out of sight of the human species.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the theories is the reason they were called stone giants is because their bodies were so strong. There are legends that arrows bounced off of these creatures. But if you can go back to the former slide that we
with the
I think it's
art.
a second. Yeah, right
This
there.
one.
So we talk
Yep.
about oral traditions and things like that. This is where we actually see, actual representation in stone. I believe this one is about 5,000 years old. I could be wrong, but it's right around 2,000 years old. We find this in California of all places. So we're already connecting the dots. So this is a culture that's separated from the Cheyenne. You still have these creatures. What we have there is a representation of the crying man, as they would call. Again, you were spot on in the Cheyenne legend. This was the first inhabitant of Earth. Humans then were created, and it was humanity that rejected these creatures, and that is why they are seen perpetually crying, because they would not be accepted by their fellow creatures. But yes, as we connect the dots, we see that immediately whenever we as human beings are confronted with something that is different than us, we immediately refer to those things as monstrous. And I think that we're really getting a sociological insight into what's going on here. Again, I love connecting the dots. I love to see all these kind of cross-cultural connections being made. But yes, so we have the Cheyenne in places like Tennessee coming up with the idea of the stone giants. We see this. We see the Midwestern cultures as well too, having these same ideas as well, the whole way into California. So again, whether it is cultural interplay, which is very possible, or if all these things developed in and of itself separately, they probably were, in my estimation, based upon some sort of fact.
It makes perfect sense once again, and again, you have so much a sort of mythic survival of real experiences where people carry things down, and by the time that the creature that originated the myth is long gone, even thousands of years gone, the myth remains and transforms and carries with it through the people, and of course, the people pass that on, to different cultures. And it is funny. I think we often forget that the different native tribes all across North America were wildly diverse in their beliefs, wildly diverse in their in their languages, in their belief systems, in their their magic, in their myths and everything. And it's funny, I think we tend as Americans, as European descended Americans, we tend to believe that Native American is an umbrella that refers to one type of people and they all look the same, etc. Is not terribly uncommon for the white man to believe that way, but of course isn't true. And if we need any proof or sort of rationalization for how that could have happened with these people, all we have to do is think about how things change when we just cross a state line. If you travel just a few states over from where you are into another state, you have different popular foods, different you can have a language barrier even sometimes, not in terms of the actual language being spoken, but with the terminology, the phrasing and everything else. And it can be difficult for somebody from Maine and somebody from Tennessee to understand each other occasionally. So I mean, we've all encountered that from time to time. So it's not terribly surprising that this massive, of over thousands of years, massive difference between the different tribes and their different legends would have cropped up. But they still theoretically would have crossed over between group to group with different names for these different creatures, different legends for why they exist, who they represent. And so the same legend, I think, probably transforms and takes on different roles in all these different cultures.
And those legends may have came across on the Bering Land Strip as well too. It may have definitely come with us from Asia as well. So we might be talking about something that's far more ancient than we're letting on.
No, I agree completely with that. In fact, I think we're going to be addressing in a couple of our next few creatures, we're going to be in the idea of the survival again of a much earlier cultural connection that we can hardly credit today, but that possibly came over from a different continent. But first, I do want to talk something, another one of are more dark in our list today, which is often referred to as the Owl Witch, Tataklea. The Yakima people of the Pacific Northwest have this sinister owl witch. She is literally meant to be a death spirit. And a quick note, kind of to be a little bit on the sensitive side the idea of dark witches is something that's going to come up quite a few times during the course of this list. And I want it to be understood that when we're referring to witches, we're referring to them in a folkloric sense, not in a modern perspective. There is a great deal of difference between the witches of folklore and that term being applied to sort of dark sorcery and the modern practice of witchcraft. So I don't want anybody to think that we are misunderstanding that there is a difference here, but we use the term because it is a sort of a cultural term that has come to refer to sorcery as well. So just a little note on that one. But yes, Owl Witch, I think, is one of the more frightening of these. These are a creature which is predatory, a death spirit, and the Seminole language, it was called the Stikini, and this child-eating Owl Witch, found in other tribes as well, bears distinct similarities to legends like the Navajo Skinwalker, which we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. But this is a genuinely dark creature. This is a spirit of death, a spirit which, like so many of these other monsters, is out there looking to consume humans. And like a lot of them, and this is another one where I feel like there is possibly some carryover between this and myths from the other side of the world, another child eater. And these winged female spirits who are child eaters are something that we've encountered in previous episodes, because we've talked about them when we were talking about vampires. We talked about them when we were talking about demons. Lilith, of course, a character who's been portrayed that way in later versions of the Lilith myth. And so these winged child eaters, even when we were talking about vampires, the Styurges of Greek mythology, so many that actually bear very, very similar traits in terms of both their physical appearance and their way that they prey on humanity.
Absolutely. And the Latin classification for an owl is actually from the Sturgis, that name, which is interesting. So even scientific classification included those into that. Again, we see in Cornwall, in the British Isles, that they have an owl man legend there as well, kind of like our Mothman, although it has a much deeper grammar than our modern Mothman. It goes back into ancient Celtic belief systems, and it indeed was also a devourer of children. And whenever you talked about Lilith, absolutely, this was a creature of the liminal zone, and even her attributes were these feet that had these talons like an owl does, and she's often even depicted seen around owls as her intermediaries. So again, we look at these creatures in Native American folklore, and there is such a resemblance to these other creatures from around the world that is a show in and of itself on how these kind of traditions mingled and commingled and became something very unique across the world.
I think it's almost impossible to suggest, with so many of these legends that appear to have almost perfect analogs on two different sides of the world, from a time when traveling across the oceans was virtually impossible, or at least incredibly difficult. It's almost impossible to imagine that they simply sprung up with such perfect synchronicity on two sides of the planet. And so it does beg the idea of earlier connection between these cultures. There's a lot of other theories too, some of them which are quite, I would just say, outrageous or creative. It's one of the reasons that people often talk about aliens, seeding the different populations and things like that. And that was certainly something that we could do an entire show on. I don't claim to be an expert on that kind of thing, but it's an intriguing theory. But yeah, I think it's impossible to imagine that creatures of such almost one-for-one trait, the different traits, could possibly just spring up like that. An owl witch that transforms, flies through the night, is a spirit of death and consumes children that exists in two completely separate parts of the world. It's a wide world. There's a lot of imagination, and I suppose the idea of the 100 monkeys, coming up with Shakespeare eventually, you could use that argument to suggest that these are just coincidences. But sometimes the coincidences require a greater stretch of the imagination than simply accepting that some kind of either survival of memory or communication between these cultures existed.
That's what makes the show fascinating.
It's an awful lot of crazy stuff. I say that, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm a believer that there are greater things out there than we fully understand, that science doesn't explain everything. So while we may do a lot of historical onion peeling on this show, I think sometimes when you get to the core of it, you still can't come up with a perfect rational explanation to sweep this stuff under the rug. So
absolutely, my friend.
So we were talking about the fact that this owl witch does bear some resemblance, and a couple of the other creatures do as well, to another native legend of another kind of dark witch, and this is the Skinwalker. And I believe, at least briefly, addressed the topic of Skinwalkers way back in the beginning. Excuse me, hiccups. Way back in the beginning when we did our show on werewolves and shapeshifters, because this is a shapeshifter from primarily Navajo legend, although other tribes definitely have their idea of both shapeshifting within their magical system and also dark witches that use this magic. But Navajo legend tells us of dark witches who take the shapes of animals or even other people to seek revenge, to steal, or fulfill other evil desires. And the thing about skinwalkers is that the skinwalker myth is almost universally and steal people's lives, and they shapes to take over their lives, over their wild, and so they are darkest or magic. And it's a fascinating skinwalkers took, or as wolves or as coyotes. And coyotes have a lot of interesting sort of mythic as predators. And the thing about skinwalkers is that I'm sorry, waiting to jump to a slide here. Oh, and I actually I overshot there. Didn't mean to do that. Give me 1 second here. You know what? I'm a technical marvel as usual here. There we go. These dangerous malefactors were among the most feared in native lore because they could be anyone. That's what made them terrifying. The thing about skinwalkers is that your wife, your husband, your son, your daughter, your best friend, the chief of the village, anyone could be a skinwalker. Not only could they be a skinwalker, in their secret life, but they could also have been a perfectly good person whose body was taken over by a skinwalker. And so they were always looking out for changes in behavior, people behaving oddly, believing that possibly this evil witch had possessed them and taken their skin. So that's a pretty terrifying idea. Something that we've seen plenty of horror films explore, the idea of that possession in a sense, but something that skinwalkers were meant to be capable of. And so definitely one of the darker characters from Navajo myth.
Right. And within the Native American cultures in which these figures appear, even saying the name Skinwalker could bring evil onto yourself. So these were things to be feared. One of those kind of things where you don't go out after night by yourself, you don't whistle, you don't do anything to kind of draw attention to you. That these are part of the world out there. It's part of that demon haunted world, and it's best to go for avoidance in this case. But yeah, absolutely, there is no such thing as a good skinwalker. They are only malevolent creatures. And the idea of the witch, and I think that we should talk about that for a little bit, because I don't want to sound like we're appropriating that culture. So I think that when we talk about the witch in Native American cultures, we're getting very close to a shaman. Wouldn't you suggest that as well too? Just as the witch in the European mentality would work with the natural world around them, so too did the shaman, but from a much deeper and a much more ancient level than what we derive the word witch from. So this was a person, male or female, that was able to manipulate the world around them through natural means and through incantations and such.
Absolutely. And again, so the idea of there were magic users or magic workers in these in these cultures who were people who were good, who were people who served the community, who were in touch with the forces of nature, and that was something that was fairly common. In fact, many of the native tribes throughout both North and South America had very magical traditions. Their lives were full of magic. They used charms and incantations all the time, but it was specifically this dark magic that ended up becoming associated with what we would call, in the European language, we would call witch. And that name, that word, because it had such negative connotations, ended up bleeding over into sort of contemporary native language. And it's just one of the reasons why they might Skinwalker as a wolf witch or as a dark witch. And so that term certainly gets a lot of use, but it doesn't apply to all magic users. And interesting, doesn't apply to all shapeshifters. Shapeshifting was something that was very common in a lot of Aboriginal societies all over the planet. That's something we talked extensively about in our very first show way back when we did our show on werewolves. But this was not innocent shape shifting, and it wasn't shape shifting for the good of the tribe. This was shape stealing for the good of the sorcerer, and always, as you said, always in a negative connotation.
Perfectly stated.
Now we accidentally gave a little bit of a preview of one of our other monsters, an interesting one, which a little on the Godzilla-ish side here, but one that you had suggested and I had never heard of before, Ogua. From the now you're gonna have to pronounce this one for me. Monongahela, River Valley, because that's got to be pretty close to you, I believe, over there in PA. But and of course, bleeding over into West Virginia, this man-eating beast of legend, which is effectively half snapping turtle and half alligator, and roughly the size of a Volkswagen, and certainly nothing that you would want to encounter if you were going for a swim on a lovely summer day. But the Ogua is oh, now see, here I actually genuinely see, this is why we're so human here. I've used exactly the same text for 2 slides. I was rushing through today, but here we've got 2 fun pictures, at least, of this fascinating creature. But that's all right, Ron, because I know you know a bit about this beastie, and so I'm going to let you expo on it. And I don't know if you've ever encountered one. I would certainly hope not.
No, unfortunately, I have not. But the Monongahela, that is one of the 3 rivers that form down in Pittsburgh. That's where the Allegheny and the Ohio and the Monongahela come. No, hold on a second. The Allegheny and the Monongahela come together to form the Ohio River. That's it, at the point where our stadium sit, okay? So that's the 3 rivers right there. And I was doing research one time to try to come up with some great stories about Native American beliefs along these rivers. And I came up with this fascinating monster. Now, later on, it started to take on these attributes of something that was much more reptilian, something more like a very large snapping turtle. But some of the very beginning reports that I had was something a lot less sinister, something much more natural. There was reports of deer coming down to the water, down to the banks to get a drink, and these things snatching them off the shore. Now, we can say a couple of things. Native American cultures loved their children as much as we did as well. There was no lifeguard on duty, so these things would serve as a type of boogeyman to keep the kids away from the water. Absolutely. But there's so many naturalistic elements whenever they report these things about how that they would feed and how that they would swim up the rivers. So I started to look at in some of the history behind different types of animals. And I know by the founding of Jamestown in 1607, there were alligators as far north as the Potomac River. So it's very possible that an alligator somehow found itself into the Allegheny, and that spurred this legend that continues with us to this day. But I am now under the conclusion that I believe that what we have here in the Ogua is a remnant remembrance of an encounter with a bull shark. And I will tell you why. The Ohio River will eventually feed into the Mississippi River. And we know that bull sharks have went as far up the Mississippi River as outside of Elton, Illinois. It's about 900 miles or so. So we know that they are capable of doing that. And when we think of a time whenever these waterways were not domesticated and not controlled in any way, it's very possible that some of these, predators started to come into areas where you would not think that they would exist. So I think that that's where this comes from, and the more reptilian look developed later on. But I think that this creature was indeed based upon something that was flesh and blood and easily categorized in our modern science.
It's a great coincidence that you would mention that, because we were talking about these creatures swimming up into the rivers before you even got to the shark saw. I was going to bring up that few months last summer when we did our program sharks, we talked about in the sort of series of New Jersey shark attacks that inspired Jaws, that one of the incidents was when one of these sharks, if there was more than one of these animals, actually did swim up a river quite a ways inland, ended up killing several people at that time. And that was something that nobody thought would ever happen and was completely impossible. So I think it's a fascinating and very plausible idea that a bull shark would actually make their way up the river, which is not unheard of, and that they would have never seen anything like that before. Certainly had minimal, not being a coastal tribe, would have had minimal encounter with any kind of a creature of that kind. And one one look of in a muddy river of this thing turning over and getting a flash of teeth, and you wouldn't really know what its physical structure was. You certainly wouldn't imagine that it was a large fish. You probably would have imagined that it was something closer to a croc or a giant snapping turtle. So it's reasonable to think that would have evolved that way. Also, you brought up a great point, because this is something we talked about during our episode on Celtic folklore and myth, which was very similar structurally to the one that we're doing tonight, which is that so many of these stories, even if they have a basis in reality, are also cautionary tales and a way to keep your kids in line. And that's how some of the greatest monster legends exist, is by warning your children about the dangers that face them in the woods, and in the woods or in the water or anywhere else that they may play on their own, and a way to keep your kids safe, and that they kind of grow into these monstrous tales.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And that's as worthy of study as we're doing right now. I love the idea of sociology and the way language forms reality.
Oh, it very much does. Now, there is another fascinating, I think, survival or carryover here with this next creature. And I didn't know until I started researching tonight's show that this did exist in native myth, and I was absolutely fascinated. So here we go. We have Kanonsionti. Again, boy, I'm probably butchering that. I hope we don't have any native viewers in the house tonight listening to us butcher these various languages. But the Kanonsionti, a flying disembodied head from Iroquois legend with an insane hunger. Many such nightmares, it particularly crave the blood of children. Now, for any of you who may have seen our program on vampires that we did a month back, you remember that we spoke of the Malaysian Penang. And this is a creature. Of course, I'm freezing up here, but this is a creature that is virtually identical in almost every way. It's impossible not to point out the resemblance, because this also preys on children. It is also a disedwise between the Penang and Kanonsionti, I get really butchering that, is that the Penanggalan, when it leaves its body, which is a corpse, it's basically an undead creature, drags its innards behind it. But with the native supposed long hair, so physically and structurally, it even looks and acts in a very similar way. But the idea of a floating, flying head, this disembodied head of an undead creature which flies through the night and actually seeks out the blood of children, that is, to me, far too much of a coincidence. To me, it's an extraordinary one. And the idea that the people of the Malaysian culture or Asian cultures would have had contact with natives, other than by the Bering Strait, and people bringing old legends with them, it seems impossible to imagine. And yet here we have these two virtually identical legends popping up, surviving to this day.
Yeah, a flying skull with its innards hanging out is really kind of hard to develop independently of each other.
Well, to imagine that, it just sprung up, organically, and that both of them were meant to be, hunting down children.
That's right. That's right.
It is a great way. No, I have been in a survival or a cross communication. And I think, to me, one of the reasons that these things are so important is because I think it's so easy. And we're going to go a little woke, as we often do on this show, but it's so easy to what we call other people, to make people feel like other, to suggest that a culture is beyond understanding, that a culture is so foreign to us that they practically are another species altogether. We've talked about that a little bit tonight, the idea of our intent, our tendency to do that. But the truth is that borders of countries, borders of lakes, rivers, and things like that, anyway we draw these borders, are imaginary things, or at the very least they're man's own creation, and that depending on what side of an imaginary line you're born on, we shouldn't consider people to be so very different. They may grow up in a different area with different foods and different languages, but that almost all people are virtually the same, and that we ultimately have a common answer somewhere down the line. That certainly, when we see even how much our folklore and our culture cross-pollinates, and that we come up with these same ideas, it's hard to see these people as quite as other as we have a tendency to make them seem. So I feel like, it's one of the best, most valuable things about the show is that we do bring these cultural ideas, to people and get to show people just how similar we all are in the long run.
And as a researcher, the first thing I always do is look at any Aboriginal notion of these particular legends, because that's really where we're getting to the root and the actual truth of what's going on.
Oh, agreed, completely.
Yes, but there is a tendency, because with any society that is conquered, the conquerors always are the ones that write the history, correct? And
Very
it's
true.
easy to conquer a people whenever you see them as something less than you are. And that is a shame, because these are great stories. These are great tales. These are great. At the very least, we're losing a tradition that is vanishing day by day, and it really does need to be collected and needs to be preserved. And quite frankly, it needs to be honored, because anytime you lose a cultural memory of anything, you're hurting the human race as a whole.
I agree. Very, very much agree. And you're saying about it's easy to dehumanize people if you need to conquer them. It's also a way to keep power over your own people, because when we create an other, we create an enemy. When we create an other, we create a target, a scapegoat. We talked about the scapegoats, I think, during our episode on the demonic. Is the idea is that sometimes when you need to coalesce people underneath you and get people to follow you, what you need is to give them a tangible enemy, and that tangible enemy is often most easily accomplished by finding someone that appears on the surface to be different than you and painting them as so other that they can't possibly be allowed into your space, allowed to take your jobs, allowed to marry your children, or things like that. And so this othering is something that has unfortunately become very common. And by the way, not to throw white people under the bus, there are cultures all over the world who have always done this, but it's always been a very successful tactic, is the othering of people to turn them into monsters. And unfortunately, that is something that we have seen time and time again throughout the course of our many episodes, is how often we make monsters where they did not exist before.
That's right. And it's interesting to point out, and I'm glad you brought that up, because the Gaelic language is falling apart as well, too, because at one time, whenever the British started expansion, places like Scotland could not even speak the language in schools because they wanted to do away with it. So this is something that, again, is part of our human society, and we do definitely need it to change. And one of the reasons why I like to connect dots so much whenever we talk about the paranormal and the supernatural and through legends is to show us how much we have in common rather than how different we are.
I agree. And, there's one more legend that I want to get to before we close up for the evening. And this is one which is, again, it's a remarkable parallel. And I thought it was fascinating. This is another one that is new to me, and I was thrilled to learn about it. And this is, let's see, Skade Gamuk. Okay. So again, apologize to anyone out there who can speak these languages. The Wabanaki were an earlier tribe that have survive in several smaller tribes throughout the Northeast, especially in the Maine area. But these ghost witches of Wabanaki lore appear when a sorcerer's magic is too strong to stay dead. And so these creatures are cursed with undeath and return to torment the living, very much like what we would consider to be vampires. Now, in keeping with their undead state, these resurrected evildoers feed on the living and are known to devour the hearts of their still living victims. So once again, we have a creature who's very, very similar to the other native legend, being the skinwalker, where we have this dark witch or magician who is so evil that their magic actually carries forth from beyond the grave and gives them the ability to rise forth from death, to continue their evil ways, but to survive beyond death by feeding on the living. So here we have what is both a sort of a skinwalker, but also a native version of a vampire. And that is fascinating to me because, again, we have this incredible survival of the hungry ghost idea, the ghost that is continuing to exist beyond death by feeding on the living. And is it possible? Certainly, I think it is, that this was a completely spontaneous emergence of this belief in two completely different sides of the planet. But here we go, is a native vampire.
Absolutely, yeah. One of those fascinating things. I would like to see a movie made of that. Wouldn't that be a cool one?
I would like to see that. It's interesting because I think that it is always a little bit challenging when you do these kind of things, because what you don't want to do, and we have a tendency to do, is demonize a culture by doing that. And I think that a lot, when you have the wrong culture making these movies, it can feel a little bit abusive. But when you get the right people behind the lens of a camera, or the right person writing it, and they can do it with respect for the culture, I think it does work out a little bit better that way. So I would love to see a native filmmaker, native scriptwriter actually write some good horror based on the legends of these various native tribes, because it really is a rich it's a rich area, it's a rich source of story. And for me, 100% behind seeing some good native horror.
Absolutely. One of my son's favorite movies is Apocalypto from Mel Gibson. And because he was a white guy that made it, there's a lot of backlash about that. But we have the parallel too with Cuckoo Khan, that needed these hearts that were ripped out of human beings' chest that were still beating. That it somehow was able to feed off the blood, or take that as some sort of appropriation for prayers that were being said. So again, we see this parallel in Mesoamerica as well too, with gods themselves that need to devour beating hearts and drink human blood in order to be appeased.
And that happens again. The legends of sort of heart eaters all over the world, and the idea that you can take the strength of your enemies by consuming their heart. Or in some cultures, the Celts actually, they say that early Celts, with the sacrificing of people, that there was the drinking of blood and things like that, not to be gruesome, but just to literally to take on the strength and the power of your enemy. That's something that happens literally all across the world. So it becomes easy to demonize one culture over another, especially if the sort of state of their cultural evolution is earlier than ours, and we still see somebody doing these kind of things. We tend to assume that these people are savages for that. But if we look far back enough in any culture, no matter whose it is, and no matter how highfalutin they often think they are, it's very likely you're going to find human sacrifice, even cannibalism. And that is something that unfortunately, thankfully, not a whole lot of that left today. We've run across that in our talks many times. But yeah, no, there's none of us innocent of that kind of behavior if you go back far enough on our time scale.
That's what I call it. It's the collective skeleton in our family closet.
So, well, Boyles, we are coming up on the 9 o'clock hour in just a few minutes here. And so, as always, we want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. Before we go, I want to quickly shout something out here, which is that I have a new book in production right now, or rather in process of writing. And I'm very, very excited about it. It's a project I've wanted to do for many years. And this book is called Hunting the Beast. And I'm going to be on the track of werewolf folklore, but specifically be in the spring heading to France to one of my favorite legends, the legend of an amazing werewolf legend, which I've known about since I was a kid. So if you do happen to be interested in this, the hardcover edition, which will be out right now, it says November, but the truth is that I expect to get it done a little earlier, and I will probably release it maybe in the early autumn of next year. But Hunting the Beast's exclusive hardcover edition is available now for pre-order on Ghost Boy Press, and you can expect that to be in print towards the end of 2023. And I am very excited about finally doing the werewolf book I've meant to do for years. So anybody interested in werewolf lore, or even just getting a signed numbered first edition, a couple of people that are in our list tonight actually have already purchased them, including John. So want to thank you for that. But so please feel free to visit ghostboypress.com and check that one out.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it myself. The Beast of Gévaudan is one of my favorite legends as well.
It's an amazing old legend. I've got a cram to learn some French before I go there, but very, very much looking forward to it. So guys, with that, we're going to close up for the evening. Again, always, as ever, want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. We hope on behalf of everyone at Monday Night Monsters and Dead Air Paranormal that you guys have a wonderful evening. Want to thank those of you who dropped a little donation for us tonight. That really always helps tremendously, and hope that you guys are all going to have, especially you U.S. people who actually celebrate Thanksgiving out there, have a fantastic Thanksgiving celebration, and hopefully get to see some friends or some loved ones for that. And we will look forward to seeing you in 1 week on the next episode of Monday Night Monsters. For the now, folks, just wish every thanks with some Amityville Thanksgiving.
And if I'm not mistaken, next week we'll be
Good night,
talking to a
guys.
real vampire.
Oh.